At 71 years old, Eleanor believed that a life built on love was the most valuable thing a person could leave behind. After 42 years of standing beside a man through every storm, every triumph, and every silent sacrifice, she walked into that attorney's office expecting, at the very least, to be honored. Instead, she was handed something worse than nothing. She was handed proof that the man she had devoted her entire existence to had, in the cold language of his will, considered her little more than a convenience. The estate went to the stepchildren. The accounts went to the stepchildren. The investments, the properties, the legacy, all of it, transferred to people who had spent 4 decades making Eleanor feel like a polite stranger in her own home. What they received with barely concealed triumph, they believed was everything. What Eleanor received, a worn envelope, a tarnished brass key, and an address she had never once heard Walter mention, they dismissed with laughter. But greed has always had a way of blinding people to what truly matters. Because what was waiting for Eleanor at the end of a forgotten dirt road in a town no one had ever heard of wasn't just a house. It was a secret Walter Caldwell had spent 42 years quietly, carefully, devotedly protecting, and a love so immense it could only be fully revealed after his very last breath. Eleanor Grace Harmon had been 29 years old when she first met Walter Caldwell, and the circumstances of that meeting had set the tone for everything that followed, complicated, unexpected, and rooted in something neither of them had gone looking for. She had been teaching 4th grade at Whitmore Elementary School in Greenwich, Connecticut, the kind of teacher parents requested by name, whose students remembered her decades later. Walter had walked into parent-teacher conferences on a rainy October evening in 1982, looking like a man with very little patience for sitting in a small plastic chair. He was 47, a successful real estate developer whose name was attached to half the commercial buildings being constructed across Fairfield County, broad-shouldered, silver-templed, carrying the confidence of someone who had never doubted he was the most important person in any room. He was there about his youngest son, Derek, who was struggling with reading and acting out in class. Eleanor told him, without a trace of intimidation, that his son wasn't a problem child. He was a child who needed more patience than he was clearly receiving at home. She watched Walter's expression shift from impatience to surprise to something that looked quietly like respect. He asked her to dinner 2 weeks later. She said no 3 times before finally saying yes. Walter's 3 children were grown or nearly so. Vivian was 22, sharp-tongued and calculating. Brandon was 19, loud and entitled. Derek was 10, the same child in Eleanor's classroom, confused and angry in the way children become when their parents' divorce has never been properly explained to them. His first wife, Gloria, had left 4 years earlier, and the children had never fully forgiven their father, redirecting much of that anger toward Eleanor instead. "You think you're going to replace our mother," Vivian had said at the wedding reception, her voice perfectly pleasant, her eyes entirely cold. "You're a school teacher from Bridgeport. You don't belong in this family." Eleanor replied that she wasn't there to replace anyone, only because she loved their father. Vivian smiled the way people smile when they've already decided they've won. "It lasted 42 years. Eleanor gave those years completely. She left teaching, a decision she would quietly mourn, because Walter's social obligations required a partner who was available, flexible, and endlessly gracious. She managed their sprawling Georgian colonial in Greenwich, entertained their clients, remembered every spouse's name and every child's birthday, sent handwritten notes and thoughtful gifts, and made every person who walked through their front door feel genuinely welcomed. She tried faithfully with the stepchildren, kept their childhood bedrooms exactly as they'd left them, attended Brandon's lacrosse games even when he didn't acknowledge her, tutored Derek through his reading struggles. They never accepted her. In 42 years, not one of them ever called her anything warmer than her given name, delivered with the flatness of people, ensuring she understood her place. She left Greenwich before sunrise on a Tuesday morning in October, 3 weeks after the reading of the will. The envelope had sat on her kitchen table for those 3 weeks, its paper worn soft as cloth at the edges from the number of times she had picked it up and set it back down without opening it fully. Inside, a key on a small brass ring, an address printed in Walter's deliberate hand, not typed, handwritten, and a single sentence beneath it, for Eleanor, only Eleanor, always. She had told no one where she was going, not her sister in Hartford, not her friend Margaret, who had been calling every day since the funeral, not her own attorney, though she would think of that later and be glad she'd said nothing. She loaded a thermos of coffee into the passenger seat, turned the heat low against the October chill, and drove. The address was in Litchfield County, the quieter, older part of Connecticut that most people from Fairfield County passed through only on the way to somewhere else. The highway gave way to state routes, which gave way in turn to roads without center lines, bordered by stone walls the color of old pewter. The trees had turned fully. She drove through corridors of amber and rust, through towns whose names she half recognized from road signs she'd passed for decades without stopping. The air that came through the car vent smelled of wood smoke and fallen leaves, and the particular cold sweetness of late October countryside. Eleanor had driven this road in silence for an hour before she realized she hadn't turned on the radio. She hadn't thought to. She was listening to something else, the sound of her own thoughts moving slowly, like water through a stream partly iced over. There was grief in her, yes. There was also something she couldn't quite name. Not excitement, not hope. She had learned in 42 years to hold hope at a careful distance. It was closer to what she had always felt on the first morning of a new school year, the particular alertness of standing at the edge of something unknown. She almost turned back outside a small town called Morris when the GPS directed her off the paved road entirely and onto gravel. The sound of it under her tires was startling. A sound she hadn't heard in years, low and deliberate, like the road itself was asking if she was certain. She sat with her hands on the wheel for a full minute, the engine idling, looking at the narrow track disappearing into the tree line ahead. Walter had never once mentioned this place, not in 42 years of conversation, of late dinners and long drives and the kind of quiet evenings where people run out of things to perform and simply speak. He had brought her to France and to Scotland and to a rented house in Nantucket every August for 20 years. He had never brought her here. She could not decide, sitting on that gravel road, whether this felt like betrayal or like tenderness, and she suspected it might be both. She drove on. She almost turned back a second time 4 miles later, when the road curved sharply, and the tree line grew so close overhead that the light all but disappeared. But then the trees opened, suddenly, the way they sometimes do in New England, with no warning, and what she found herself looking at caused her to bring the car to a full stop in the middle of the lane and simply sit. It was not a mansion. That was the first thing she understood, and the understanding moved through her like a slow, deep breath. Vivian had assumed, when she'd glimpsed the key and address, that it might be another investment property, something commercial, something to be valued and divided. Brandon had made a joke about a love shack that had landed in the room like a stone into still water, but what Eleanor was looking at now was neither of those things. It was a farmhouse, original to the land, she guessed, probably late 1800s, bone structure solid, with wide board siding painted the particular shade of white that New England farmhouses achieve only after decades of weathering. Someone had restored it with enormous care. The restoration was not the kind that erases history, it was the kind that honors it. The lines of the original structure were intact, the proportions unchanged, but every board was tight, every window plumb, the wide front porch running the full length of the house and bearing, even in October, the quiet evidence of a chair positioned for someone who liked to read in the afternoon light. Behind the house, visible from where she sat, was water, a lake, small and private, its surface the flat silver of an October sky. A dock extended from the bank. A single wooden rowboat was tied to it, hull up, winterity. She sat in the car for several minutes before she could make herself move. The key was cool and solid in her palm as she walked the stone path to the front door, flat stones, she noticed, fitted with the kind of patience that cannot be paid for, only built. The garden on either side of the path had been put to bed for winter, cut back, mulched, tended. Someone had been here recently. The evidence of it was everywhere, the lawn raked, the gutters clean, the firewood stacked in precise rows beside the porch. Walter had been here, recently, perhaps many times. The lock turned on the first try. The door swung inward on hinges that made no sound at all. Inside, the house smelled of old wood and dried lavender and the particular stillness of rooms that have been loved in. The afternoon light came in low and golden through the west-facing windows, falling across floors of wide pine boards worn smooth by generations of feet. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, fieldstone, mortared by hand, the kind of fireplace that has stood since a time before electric heat and needed no restoration because it had simply been built the first time correctly. Alina stood in the doorway and did not speak. There was no one to speak to. She was aware of her own breathing. She took one step in, and then another, and then she stopped because of the shelves. They lined the far wall, floor to ceiling, in the way she had always imagined a room should be shelved, built-in, fitted, painted cream, bearing the weight of hundreds of books arranged not by color or size but the way a reader arranges them, by subject, by love, by the memory of when they'd last been opened. She moved toward them slowly, drawn by an instinct she didn't fully understand, and then she saw the titles and her hand went to her mouth. To Kill a Mockingbird, the edition she had taught from, the specific edition, the old paperback perennial classic with the corner bent back on chapter 10. My Antonia. Willa Cather, the author, wrote her college thesis about the collected poems of Mary Oliver, dog-eared, Little Dorrit, her mother's favorite Dickens, the one she had read aloud at the hospital in her mother's final weeks. These were not Walter's books. Walter had read real estate journals and biographies of industrialists. These were her books, her taste, her history, her interior life, assembled here with a precision that could only come from decades of paying very close attention. Her legs found the armchair near the fireplace before she consciously chose to sit down. It was upholstered in faded blue linen, exactly the shade she would have chosen for herself, worn at the armrests in the way that good chairs eventually become fitted to the person who has sat in them. She ran her hand along the fabric and found she couldn't speak and wouldn't have known to whom. She sat there for a long time, listening to the tick of a clock she couldn't yet locate and the sound of the wind moving through the old windows, which carried the low whistle of windows that fit perfectly, not drafty, not sealed tight, just breathing, as all old houses should. Then she went to the kitchen. Her late mother's china pattern was in the cabinet above the sink, white with a narrow border of blue morning glories. The pattern had been discontinued in 1971. Alina had grown up eating from these plates, and when her mother had passed, the remaining pieces had been divided among the children and gradually broken over the years until Alina had nothing left but the memory of them. She reached up and took one down and held it with both hands and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the silver lake, and did not try to stop the tears when they came. What she found inside would take the rest of the afternoon to fully understand. She found it in the expected place, which is to say, in a place so perfectly chosen that it could only have been chosen by someone who knew her completely. It was tucked inside her copy of My Antonia, her actual copy, she realized, not a replacement. The copy she had lost in the move from her apartment to the Greenwich house in 1983, which she had always assumed was packed in a box and donated by accident. Walter had kept it. He had kept it for 42 years, and it sat on his shelf, and inside it, folded in thirds along old creases that meant it had been folded and unfolded many times, was a letter of 11 pages, handwritten on cream stationery in the compact, deliberate script she recognized from birthday cards and grocery lists, and the small notes he'd left on the kitchen counter when he left early for a job site. She sat on the floor of the reading room. She was beginning to think of it as the reading room, and did not move for a very long time. She read it twice through before she trusted herself to absorb what it said. He had written it over several years, he explained. Not all at once, there were dates in the margins, small notations. March 1998, November 2003, the night after your mother's funeral, 2007. The letter had grown in the way that honest things grow, slowly in private, when the pressure of unsaid truth finally becomes greater than the fear of saying it. He began with an apology, not the reflexive, self-protective kind, not the apology of a man trying to excuse himself, but the kind that comes from someone who has looked at his own behavior for a long time in poor light and has not looked away from what he found. "I was a coward," he wrote. "I want you to have that word from me directly, because it is the accurate word and you deserve accuracy after everything you have been given in place of it." He wrote about Vivian and Brandon, about the way he had allowed their coldness to exist in his home unchallenged, not because he didn't see it, but because confronting it would have required admitting that his first marriage had failed in ways that were partly his fault, and he had never been a man who found it easy to hold his own failures without flinching. So he had kept the peace, which is to say, he had kept the silence, and Alina had been made to pay the cost of it for 4 decades while he stood by and watched and told himself that she was strong enough, that she didn't mind, that she understood. "You did understand," he wrote. "That was the tragedy of it. You understood me better than I deserved to be understood, and I used that understanding against you, though I never let myself call it that while I was doing it." He wrote about Derek, about the way Alina had tutored the boy through his reading struggles, 3 afternoons a week in the year before the wedding, sitting at the kitchen table with flashcards and patience, and the particular skill of a teacher who knows that the child who acts out is always the child who is afraid. Derek had learned to read properly, Walter wrote, in that kitchen with Alina. He had gone on to study literature at the University of Vermont. He had never told Alina this. Walter was not entirely sure Derek himself understood the full shape of what he owed her. And then Walter wrote about this place. He had found the land in 1985, 3 years into their marriage, on a drive through Litchfield County after a business meeting that had gone badly. He had pulled over to look at a for sale sign nailed to a birch tree, and something in him had understood the way certain things announce themselves quietly, without ceremony, that this was important. He bought the land that same week. He began building the house the following spring, working weekends, hearing only local craftsmen he trusted, telling no one in his professional or social circle, telling Alina least of all. "I want to explain why I didn't tell you," he wrote. "Not to excuse it, there is no excuse, but because the reason matters. I didn't tell you because I was ashamed. Not of this place, of everything else. I knew by 1985 that I had already failed you in the ways that mattered most. I had already asked you to make yourself smaller than you were. I had already permitted Vivian to speak to you the way she did at our wedding and said nothing. I had already begun to sense that my will, in its current form, was not what it should be, but I lacked the courage to change it in a way that would require explanation to my children, and so I built this instead. I built you something they couldn't touch." "It was cowardice dressed as tenderness," he wrote. "I have made my peace with that. I hope in time you will too." He wrote about the trust. An attorney named Patricia Wells in Torrington, not the family attorney, not anyone connected to the Greenwich estate, had drawn up the documents in 1992. The property had been placed in a separate revocable trust in Alina's name that year, and the trust had been funded incrementally over the following 2 decades, conservatively, quietly, through accounts in Alina's name at a small regional bank in Litchfield, accounts she had never been told existed. 20 years of Walter's income, redirected carefully, legally, through instruments designed by a woman who had understood what she was being asked to do and had done it without question. The total value of the trust, the property, the contents, the investments, Walter did not write as a number. He wrote only, "Patricia will explain the specifics. I will tell you only that it is more than enough. It was always meant to be more than enough." His final paragraph was shorter than the rest. The handwriting was different, looser, softer, written with what she recognized as the hand of someone who is tired and has stopped trying to appear otherwise. "You were the best person I knew, Eleanor. Not the most powerful, not the most admired, the best. You walked into every room of a life I had already complicated beyond repair, and you brought grace to it. You never demanded that I be better than I was, but you made me want to be, and that is something I carried every day. This house is not a consolation prize. It is what I should have given you from the beginning, a place that is entirely, irreducibly yours. I hope you can hear me when I say that I am sorry it came this way, and I hope you know, though I was often too proud or too cowardly to say it plainly while I was alive, that I loved you, specifically, completely, in the way that it is very rare to love anyone." She folded the letter along its old creases and held it against her chest and listened to the clock and the wind and the water. The discovery within the discovery. She spent the rest of the afternoon moving through the house, the way a person moves through a dream, slowly touching things, adjusting to the fact of them. The kitchen was stocked with the teas she preferred, the specific loose-leaf Earl Grey she ordered from a shop in New Haven, the chamomile she drank at night. There were dried lavender bundles tied with twine and hung from the ceiling beams the way she had hung them in her mother's house every summer. The cutting board was marble. She had mentioned once, years ago, that she preferred marble to wood for pastry, and the knife block held the French carbon steel knives she had always wanted and never bought for herself. The bedroom faced the lake. The quilt on the bed was the same pattern as the quilt her grandmother had made, which she had slept under as a child and which had fallen apart decades ago. This one was new, but made in the same pattern, double wedding ring, cream and soft blue, and she stood at the foot of the bed and understood that someone had gone looking for it specifically. She found the workshop behind the house, in a cedar-sided outbuilding she'd initially taken for a tool shed. It was not a tool shed, it was a craftsman's workshop, organized with the precision of a man who had worked with his hands his whole life and taken satisfaction in doing so. The smell of it hit her at the door, sawdust and linseed oil and something sweet she couldn't immediately identify, beeswax, she realized, used for finishing wood. The workbench ran the length of the far wall. The tools above it were hung on a pegboard, each one traced in pencil so it was visible immediately if something was out of place. On the bench itself, half-finished, a bookcase, identical in design to the shelves in the reading room, measured for a different wall, built to expand the library she hadn't yet seen. Walter had been building her library. She looked at the bookcase for a long time. She reached out and ran her hand along the edge where the router had shaped a gentle curve, smooth as a stone worn by water, sanded through progressively finer grits until it was closer to silk than wood. He had done this with his own hands. This specific curve, this specific afternoon, in this building, on this property that he had been tending for 38 years without saying a word. She walked the garden next, though the October light was fading, and she had to move carefully along the stone paths. The garden had been designed by someone who understood both beauty and practicality, raised beds for vegetables along the south side, perennials bordering the paths, a small orchard of 4 apple trees to the east that were old enough to have been planted when the property was first acquired. Beside the orchard, a rose bush. Her favorite, the pale pink climbing variety, cut back for winter, but still showing its canes in their careful pattern against the low stone wall, it had been trained along for what looked like decades. He had planted this rose before she had ever told him it was her favorite. She searched her memory and found the conversation, 1987, a dinner party in Greenwich. One of their guests had brought flowers, and Alina had said briefly, quietly, not even to Walter directly, that pale pink climbing roses were the ones she had always loved best. He had said nothing at the time. He had come here not long after and planted one. The small chapel, she thought of it as a chapel, though it bore no religious symbols, was at the far edge of the property, half hidden by a stand of birch trees whose white trunks caught the last of the afternoon light. It was barely larger than a generous closet. 4 walls, a cedar-shingled roof, a single window of old wavy glass that looked out over the lake, 2 chairs facing it, a small table between them holding a lamp and nothing else. The kind of room that is built not for any purpose but for silence, for the particular kind of quiet that people who live in noise must sometimes seek. She sat in one of the chairs. The other chair was positioned not across from hers but beside it, angled toward the same view, the lake, the silver water, the distant tree line turning dark against the last of the October sky. He had built this room for 2 people to sit beside each other and say nothing. She sat in it alone and found that it was enough. Patricia Wells drove up from Torrington on a Thursday morning 3 days later. Alina had stayed. She hadn't planned to, had brought nothing with her except the thermos and her wallet and the coat on her back, but she had found herself unwilling to leave. She had slept in the farmhouse under the double wedding ring quilt, eaten from the kitchen's modest pantry, sat in the chapel at dawn watching the lake emerge from the morning gray, and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, the particular quiet of being exactly where she was meant to be. Patricia Wells was 68, with the direct, unhurried manner of an attorney who has spent decades doing work she believes in and has stopped trying to look like anything other than herself. She arrived with a leather briefcase and a thermos of her own, sat at the farmhouse kitchen table across from Alina, and placed the documents between them with the care of someone delivering something important. The trust, she confirmed, was ironclad. Alina Grace Harmon was the sole beneficiary. The trust had been established in 1992, funded incrementally through legitimate financial instruments over the following 22 years, and structured by Patricia's firm specifically to be beyond the reach of probate, estate challenges, or any claim by Walter's existing heirs. The property had been appraised the previous spring. The investments, quietly and conservatively managed for 2 decades by a portfolio manager Patricia had recommended, had grown considerably. She slid the summary sheet across the table. Alina looked at the number for a long moment. Then she set it down and looked out the kitchen window at the lake. He was meticulous, Patricia said, with the tone of a woman who had admired the meticulousness and grieved its context in equal measure. He was afraid, Alina said. It was not a criticism. It was simply true. The stepchildren found out 11 days later. Alina did not learn the details directly. She had no interest in the details, but Margaret, who remained in Greenwich and kept an ear to the social ground, the way Alina had always been too dignified to do, called to report that Vivian's reaction had been both spectacular and entirely consistent with who she had always been. There had been phone calls to attorneys, accusations of fraud, allegations that Alina had somehow manipulated an elderly man's estate planning, an accusation that required a certain audacity, given that Alina had not known the trust existed until 3 weeks after Walter's death. There had been a demand letter from Vivian's attorney that Patricia Wells had responded to in 2 sentences. There had been a conversation, apparently, in which Brandon had said something that caused even his own attorney to go quiet for a moment. None of it touched the trust. Patricia had built it precisely for this possibility, because Walter had asked her to build it precisely for this possibility, because he had known his children well enough to predict their response with near-perfect accuracy. Alina received a voicemail from Derek. She listened to it once. He did not say much. He was not, she remembered, a man who had ever learned to say much, but what he did say was carefully chosen. "I just wanted you to know," he said, "that I'm not part of this. The lawyers, I'm not." A pause. "I've been thinking about the reading lessons. I've been thinking about them for a while." Another pause. "That's all. I just wanted you to know." She did not call him back immediately, but she saved the voicemail. The decision came to her gradually, the way honest decisions do, not as a lightning bolt, but as a recognition of something that had been forming for weeks. She spent November at the farmhouse. She learned the property's rhythms, the way the light moved across the lake from morning to evening, the sound of the apple trees in the wind, the hour at which the wood stove needed its first log if the house was to be warm by the time she rose. She drove into the town of Litchfield twice a week, where she became, in the way that people who are genuinely interested in other people always do, quickly and quietly known, the librarian. The woman who ran the historical society turned out to have grown up on a farm half a mile from the property. The owner of the hardware store, who had, he said, sold Walter Caldwell a great deal of lumber over the years, and had always assumed the man was building something private and important. He never talked about it, the hardware store owner said. Seemed like he was doing it for someone he loved. Eleanor drove back to the farmhouse in the November dark and sat with that for a long time. She had left teaching in 1984 because life had required her to. She was 71 years old. She had, the attorneys confirmed, more financial security than she would ever require for herself. And she had a farmhouse on a private lake in Litchfield County, Connecticut, with 6 bedrooms, a craftsman's workshop, a half-finished library, a garden, a chapel, and a dock, and the particular quality of silence that people who have spent their lives in service to others sometimes desperately need. She called Patricia Wells in December. She established the Harmon Caldwell House. She insisted on both names, over Patricia's mild suggestion that she use only her own as a nonprofit retreat, open to women over 60 who had experienced significant loss, widowhood, displacement, the particular grief of lives given entirely to others, and arrived at their end without anything left that was purely their own. Guests would come for a week at a time, in small groups of no more than 4. There would be a librarian, she advertised for one, and found a recently retired school librarian from Waterbury who wept on the phone when she understood the job and a garden, and the boats on the lake, and the chapel, and the long wide porch with its afternoon light, and very little scheduled programming beyond shared meals and the permission to do nothing. She also started the reading program in January. Once a week, at the Litchfield Library, she sat at a low table with a rotating group of 3rd and 4th graders who were struggling with reading. She used some of the same techniques she had used in 1982, sitting across a table from a 10-year-old boy named Derek Caldwell, who had been angry at the world and afraid to let anyone see it. She was still, at 71, the kind of teacher who made children feel that reading was a door rather than a wall, and that she was simply handing them the key. The first morning she drove into town for the reading group, she passed the library's front sign, hand-painted, slightly crooked, cheerful, and she thought of the worn envelope on her kitchen table in Greenwich, and the tarnished key and the address in Walter's handwriting. She thought about what it means to be handed something and not know yet what it is. She thought about 42 years, about what they had been and what they had contained, about the cowardice and the love, braided together in the way that human things so often are. She thought about the rose he had planted before she'd told him she loved roses. She thought about the letter, folded along its old creases, now held in the drawer of the bedside table in the room that faced the lake. She did not celebrate, she did not perform. She drove into Litchfield, parked the car, walked through the library door, and sat down at the low table. A small girl with her hair in 2 uneven braids looked up from her book and said, with perfect seriousness, "Are you the reading lady?" "I am," Eleanor said. The girl slid her book across the table. Elena opened it to the first page and began. There is a kind of love that has no interest in witnesses. It does not announce itself at dinner tables or perform itself for the approval of those watching. It works quietly in the early morning hours, in the spaces no one thinks to look, building something, planting something, setting aside something it may never be able to give directly. It speaks, if at all, in handwriting on old stationery, in the specific edition of a book that someone once taught from, in a rose planted before the preference was ever spoken aloud. This love is not always wise. It is not always brave. It is sometimes wrapped in enough cowardice to break the heart of the person it is meant for. But it is real unmistakably, irreducibly real, and the people who build it are building it in the only way they know how, against their own limitations, with whatever courage they can assemble. Walter Caldwell was not a good man in every sense, but he was a man who loved well in the end, and sometimes the end is where the truest things finally surface. We speak so easily of people who diminish others. They are loud and visible, and they take up a great deal of the air in every room they enter. Vivian and Brandon had spent 42 years working to make Elena feel that she was peripheral, a convenience, a background figure, a woman whose name was spoken with the flatness of people who want you to understand exactly where you stand. What they never understood, because smallness tends to limit the imagination this way, is that the person they had decided to dismiss was the only person in their father's life who had loved him without condition. They were so busy calculating what they deserved that they never noticed what they had already lost, the model of a life lived with grace, the example of love offered freely, the kind of presence that makes a household feel like a home. They received the estate. They did not receive what mattered. The irony is that they never knew enough to grieve it. It is a difficult thing at 71 to receive something you were always meant to have. It requires a particular kind of courage, not the courage of youth, which is loud and forward-moving, but the quieter courage of someone who has learned what it means to begin again. Elena could have refused it. She could have turned down the road when the GPS directed her off the pavement, could have taken the envelope and the key and the worn address and placed them in a drawer, and let them be the last mystery of a marriage she would spend years trying to understand. She was tired. She had every right to be tired. But she drove down the gravel road, and she opened the door, and she sat on the floor of that reading room with 11 pages of handwritten truth, and she did not look away from what she found. That choice, small, unglamorous, made alone in a car on a Tuesday morning in October, was itself a form of courage, and it opened into everything that followed. A life of dignity is not a life without sorrow. It is not a life from which injustice is absent, from which loss is withheld, from which the people we love never fail us. Elena Grace Harmon had been failed in ways that would have broken someone with less interior strength. She had given 42 years to a household that never fully received her, and she had done it with her chin level and her heart open and her handwriting careful on every note and birthday card. That grace was not rewarded for most of those years in the ways she had a right to expect, but grace has its own long arithmetic, and the final accounting sometimes takes longer than a lifetime to arrive. What was waiting for Elena at the end of a dirt road in Litchfield County was not just a house, not just a trust, not just proof that she had been known and loved in full. It was the rest of her life, unhurried, rooted, given over to the work she had always loved and the people she had always known how to reach. She did not receive this as a triumph. She received it as a beginning, and at 71, standing at the low library table with a small girl's book open between them, beginning was exactly enough.